The New America Foundation hosts a conference tomorrow on fighting terrorism. They'll look at how Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups are changing their tactics and how the U.S. needs to respond. C-SPAN 2 will have live coverage beginning at 9:15 a.m. Eastern.
Wednesday, the third and final presidential debate between Senators Barack Obama and John McCain, moderated by CBS News' Bob Schieffer from Hofstra University in Hempstead, New York. Our coverage begins live at 7:30 p.m. Eastern with your calls. The debate at 9, with your reaction and analysis following the debate. And visit C-SPAN's Debate Hub for a blog and Twitter roundup, embeddable video, an interactive timeline, and live streaming debate cam video. You'll find Debate Hub at cspan.org/politics.
In February, the U.S. Navy shot down an errant satellite over the Pacific Ocean as a test of missile defense technology. Now a briefing on that test and what it means for ballistic missile defense. The Center for National Security Law hosts this hour 45-minute event.
Hello, I am John Norton Moore, the Director of the Center for National Security Law of the University of Virginia. And on behalf of the Center, I would like to welcome you to our latest in our Capitol Hill Forum series, the shoot-down of the failing NRO satellite, implications for ICBM missile defense. On February 20th of this year, the Ageis-class cruiser USS Lake Erie shot down an errant United States intelligence satellite using an SM-3 missile traveling at more than 17,000 miles per hour, 130 miles over the Pacific Ocean. This prevented the catastrophic spread of 1,000 pounds of toxic hydrazine fuel over a population center had the satellite crashed to Earth. This extraordinary action involved the heroic efforts of hundreds of government and industry experts. As part of its Capitol Hill Forum series, the Center for National Security Law is bringing together today leading authorities to examine this remarkable success and particularly to consider its possible implications for United States missile defense programs. The Center for National Security Law is a non-profit, nonpartisan center at the University of Virginia which focuses on research, teaching, and public information about important national security issues. As we begin today, I would like to call on Lieutenant General Henry Trey Obering, III of the United States Air Force, who is the Director of the Missile Defense Agency in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. That agency is a presidentially chartered and mandated by Congress to acquire highly effective ballistic missile defense systems for forward deployed and expeditionary elements of the United States Armed Forces. As Director, General Obering is the acquisitions executive for all ballistic missile defense systems and programs. It's a special honor to call on the General to describe this remarkable achievement and some of the work being done in ABM systems. General?
Thank you very much, John. I'm very pleased to be here this afternoon to be able to share some of our perspectives and especially the experience that we had. I also want to point out that we have the captain of the Lake Erie in the audience here, Captain Henderson. Thank you for being here as well. If I could have my first slide there, please. What I want to do is put this in context with respect to the overall missile defense program and then talk specifically about the operation that we conducted and as John said, some of the implications for the overall missile defense. As John said, in late 2006, there was a launch of a reconnaissance satellite. There was contact lost with the ground station within hours. It entered a decaying orbit and was predicted to enter the atmosphere sometime in 2008. I was contacted about a week before Christmas, and I was asked about what the options were that could be made possible through our missile defense capabilities to be able to protect the Earth, frankly, from this hazard. It was a very toxic fuel on board the aircraft that all of our experts, including the ones within the Intel community, within the Missile Defense Agency, within NASA, had agreed would survive reentry and could pose a hazard to personnel. The rationale for the decision to intercept was we wanted to be able to determine the time and the place of the satellite demise, and we also, as I said, wanted to prevent and minimize any impact of populated areas and a chance of casualties. What's really important here is there was an option that we have never had historically in any type of an operational capability that we could at least investigate. Now, if I could go to the next slide, the reason that we have this option is because on the missile defense side of the equation, we have been very concerned about the proliferation of ballistic missiles throughout the world, especially since the 1972 timeframe when we signed the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty with the then Soviet Union. For many countries, these missiles are becoming their air force of choice. They're opting to bypass conventional air forces and going directly to these weapons. The warfighters in the United States today are confident in the systems that we have deployed, and they are confident in their effectiveness, and they are continuing to ask for their increased improvement to address even more complex threats. We believe that missile defense can actually devalue these weapons for their proliferation around the world. I believe personally that one of the reasons they have historically proliferated is because there has been no defense against them, and so they are held in high value by these countries. If we can field effective missile defenses against these, I believe we'll begin to change that equation. We know that it strengthens deterrence. It enables us to have an additional option. It provides an additional option to our leaders other than preemption or retaliation against these threats. And when all else fails, when all of our arms control initiatives, our treaties, et cetera, fail, if that happens, the only option you have is to be able to protect, in order to protect your population, deployed forces, allies, and friends, is to be able to shoot down the actual warhead. And I will tell you that in my 4.5 years as director of the Missile Defense Agency, I guess one of my biggest surprises when I'm asked is the little explosion in the international arena and the interest in missile defense. We have 18 nations around the globe that are working with us in some capacity in missile defense, from the very high end like Japan with cooperative programs all the way down to just basic research and development. If I could have the next slide, please. Two countries in particular are the main proliferators and of main concern, North Korea. There's been a continual march of basic, what we call the old Scud technology into longer and longer ranges and more capabilities to include more modern technologies such as solid propellants and even some of the technologies that we use on the space shuttle. And they continue this evolution and this development. And on the next slide, we see the same thing happening in Iran, this progression from shorter range missiles to longer and longer range missiles, which is really interesting because in any regional threat with Iran, a missile of about 1,300 kilometers would be able to reach Israel and any of the U.S. bases in the region. And yet, they continue to develop longer and longer range weapons, flying 2,000-kilometer missiles and beyond, which is of great concern to us. Now, on the next slide, in order to meet this emerging threat, we have developed, with the leadership and the support of Congress, as well as the administration, we've developed a program of record now that begins to build an integrated layered defense against these weapons. And these are some of the tools that we could bring to bear when we were asked if we could do anything about the satellite that was coming in. We have defenses underway in our boost phase segment with our airborne laser and a very high acceleration interceptor called kinetic energy interceptor. The mid-course segment, which, by the way, except for the very short-range rockets that have rained down on Israel and other places, that mid-course segment is in space. So we do a lot of work in space in the missile defense business. And then the terminal phase, of course, is as they re-enter the atmosphere. And we've built defenses in the mid-course as well to include the silo-based interceptors that we've loaded in Alaska and California and that we're proposing for Poland, for example. Our sea-based interceptors that can handle the short to medium and the low intermediate range missile threat in the mid-course. And then the terminal phase, everything from the PAC-3 Patriot capability that was combat proven in Iraqi Freedom just recently in 2003, along with what we call a terminal altitude area defense that operates inside and outside the atmosphere in combination with a sea-based terminal program to provide this layering of defense against these weapons. All of these are supported by a family of sensors that you see across the slide at the top that includes modifications to existing radars, like the ones in Shemya, Alaska, or Beale in California, or the United Kingdom at Fylingdales, to transportable radars that we've deployed to Japan and have plans for other locations, to sea-based radars that provide us flexibility as well. Today, all we do from space primarily is we are able to detect launches and determine projected impact points. We cannot target from space. That's something I'll be happy to talk about in the panel because I think that that's a critical capability for the future. And we are actually launching 2 demonstration satellites next year to show that functionality to be able to target from space. Now, if you go to the next slide, what we've done in just the last 4 years, we fielded 24 of the long-range interceptors in Alaska and California. We have 33 of the sea-based interceptors on 17 of the Aegis ships, and we have 29 of what we call the sea-based terminal, the shorter-range defenses, deployed as well. And on the next slide, in terms of sensors, I talked about the radars that we've modified in California, Alaska, and the United Kingdom, and the ones that we deployed to include that very powerful radar that's at the bottom left-hand side of the screen. That's a 30-story platform. The radar itself is about 13 stories high. And as some of you may have heard me say in the past, it is powerful enough that if we place it in the Chesapeake Bay, we can detect and track a baseball-sized object over San Francisco. Those are the types of sensors that also allowed us to be able to be successful in the shoot-down of the satellite. Next slide. And finally, in our fielding, we now have an operational system. It is manned by Army, Navy, and Air Force personnel under the integrated control of combatant commanders. We have these combatant communications, command and control elements that have been deployed from Hawaii to Nebraska to Colorado to the National Capital Region. So this is up and operational as I stand here today. Next slide. And this is the configuration of the system that I said we've deployed everything from a transportable radar to Japan to the modification of existing sensors in California, etc., the loading of the interceptors in California and Alaska, and then our sea-based assets, the ships, as well as the sea-based interceptors. Now, if you go to the next slide, and I'd like you just to bear with me for 1 second, why do we have confidence in this? Well, it's because of our flight test record. We now have 35 of 43 successful hit-to-kill intercepts in the atmosphere and in space since 2001. And by the way, the basic technology that these interceptors operate under is a hit-to-kill. We have no warheads. We have no explosives. We actually hit the incoming warhead with our sensors, and the kinetic energy generated by the tremendous speeds is what basically destroys the warheads. Now, if you can go out and go into the video, I just want to show you a couple of videos here that we have. The first one is our THAAD video. This is the Terminal Altitude Area Defense. This is a program that is capable of intercepting in the atmosphere and outside the atmosphere. And this was a test that we conducted in June of April of 2007. Now, what you see here is a target launch from a ship that's about 200 miles off the coast of Hawaii. A very threat realistic representative target. Next, you'll see the interceptor launch. This is a canisterized interceptor from the island of Kauai. So you get an idea of the fly out, the speeds here, and there's a slow motion of the egress of the interceptor from the canister. The kill vehicle itself extends to about where the paint changes color on the interceptor. And if you look carefully here, you'll see the flyouts. Then you're going to look at some shots of the separation of the booster from the kill vehicle, as well as the intercept of the target itself. Here's the separation. There goes the kill vehicle in the upper left. The next, you're going to see the sensor shrouds come off. 2 little pieces will fly off the front end of the kill vehicle, exposing the sensors. And then if you look closely, you'll see the attitude and control system rockets firing as the target comes in from the left. This particular engagement was about 100 kilometers in altitude. Now, if you go back and go to the next one very quickly, let's go to the long range because I want to show the ship-based in the satellite shoot-down. This is a test we conducted in September of last year. This tested our long-range capability. So this is a silo-based interceptors. In this case, we were trying to emulate a launch from North Korea into the United States with an intercept from Alaska. So we launched a target from the island of Kodiak in Alaska, and we intercepted from California, from Vandenberg. Here's a flyout of the target, a 3-stage target. We think it's very threat representative. We have a camera mounted looking aft on the target. Next, you're going to see the target, the interceptor launched from Vandenberg. For this test, we had soldiers manning the console. They had no knowledge of the target launch, so that was not any foreknowledge of that. We had an operationally configured interceptor that was loaded in an operationally configured site at Vandenberg. We used a radar in California at Beale that's an operational radar. And so all aspects of this test are as realistic as we can get to try to emulate the conditions of an intercept, with the exception of decoys, and I'll talk about that as well later. So here's the silo opening and the launch of the three-stage interceptor from the silo. This is, as I said, a three-stage interceptor. It's the largest one in our inventory. It's about 60 feet long and about 54 inches wide. You'll see the staging here of the first stage. These are the types that we have loaded in Alaska and California, and a two-stage version of this. It's an identical interceptor. We just removed the third stage. It's what we're proposing for Poland. Here's the staging of the first stage. And then in this, you're going to see something very interesting. The first thing you're going to see is infrared shot of the actual intercept. And this is hundreds of kilometers in altitude. So there's the intercept. There'll be a slow motion of that. And then the next shot you're going to see are what the kill vehicle itself sees. So you're going to see objects come up in 3 squares, and you're going to see that we're tracking more than one object. In fact, in this particular intercept, we were tracking up to 5 different objects. Some of that could be separation debris. It could be the third stage of the target, etc. So you'll see the 3 black squares, the sensors on the kill vehicle. The little white boxes that are coming up are objects that it's tracking. So it's discriminating what is a warhead and what is an object that is not a warhead. And then in the 2 on the left, you'll see the actual warhead come up just before we hit. By the way, we're hitting within inches of where we're aiming, inches. And the reason we know this is we put a fiber optic coating on the warhead, and as soon as the first fiber breaks, we burst transmit that data to the ground. So we know exactly how that warhead came apart on the intercept. And if you go to the next slide, please. Now let me talk about the satellite shoot-down itself. There were several mission considerations that we wanted to make sure we addressed. The first was, as I said earlier, we wanted to be able to control the time of the intercept so that we could have an optimization of the highest probability of success. We wanted to make sure we had the lowest engagement altitude because we wanted to minimize orbital debris and try to bring that down as quickly as we could to minimize threats to satellites, etc. We wanted to make sure that we had multiple chances for intercept and that we would ensure the availability that we could verify that we actually shot and killed the hydrazine tank, which is what we were looking for. Other factors is we wanted to be very visible to the public in what we were doing. We wanted to make sure that we had emergency response in case of failure, and we wanted to make sure that we had public notification of what we were doing throughout. We did make advisories to operators of air and spacecraft. The only problem that we had in terms of consideration, it's one that I get asked a lot, is why didn't we determine where the satellite was going to actually come back into play, and then if it was going to come back into a populated area, then shoot it down. If it was going to come back in the ocean, just let it go. The problem with that is by the time we determined where it was going to actually impact, it was too late to actually intercept it if it was going to be over a populated area. So that was the consideration that forced us also to intercept. Now, if you go to the next slide, we looked at all of our programs. We looked at the ground-based, the solid-based interceptors. We looked at the terminal altitude air defense, the one that operates inside and outside the atmosphere, and we looked at Aegis. The reason that we chose the Aegis, frankly, it was the simplest to modify. It has the simplest kill vehicle, for example. It was able to give us more options in terms of the orbit that we engage the satellite on so that we could minimize the ground debris and the trace of the debris on the ground, and it gave us more than one chance to do so. Now, the only problem was the ship could not perform this mission by itself. And you'll see on the next couple of slides as to why. If you go to the next one. This is just a notional timeline of the interceptor launch, the rocket motor of the third stage pulsing as it goes through the different pulses it does to shape its trajectory, its ejection of the kill vehicle itself, and then the intercept that you see here. Now, if you go to the next slide, what you'll notice is the problem with this was the spy radar, the radar on board the ship, didn't detect the satellite and be able to track it accurately until after we would have launched the interceptor. So we had to have information off board the ship to be able to conduct this intercept. So if you go to the next slide, what we did is we had a family of sensors, many of the ones that I just showed you on the screen, to be able to generate the track information necessary to inject that into the ship's fire control system. So we launched the interceptor from the ship before the ship ever saw it, before it had a good track on that so that we could engage. And this is what we call a remote capability to be able to integrate the various sensors and shooters together to expand the detection and the engagement capability of any autonomous capability. So if you go to the next slide, we had to modify the Aegis ship. And by the way, I want to make one point. We could not do this mission and also do a missile defense mission. we had to make modifications to the ship, and that was true across the board, whether it was the ground-based mid-course program or the THAAD. We would have to make modifications that would not be compatible with the missile defense mission. In this case, we had to modify the satellite, the ship's system so that it would report a satellite as a track. Typically, we do not do that. We will reject that. If it's a satellite, they will reject that as a valid target. We had to revise where we were aiming with respect to the missile itself. We had to make modifications to both the radar as well as the fire control system. But the folks did an absolutely tremendous job in pulling all this together and being able to accomplish this mission in just 6 weeks. If you go to the next slide, these are some of the involved sensors that were used in the injection of this off-ship information into the ship's system so that we could actually affect the shoot-down. And that involves sensors from Massachusetts to Alaska, as well as sea-based assets, as well as those that were deployed in Greenland, in the United Kingdom, as well as in Hawaii. Next slide. Now, we also needed to have proof of intercept. One of the things we wanted to make sure of is that we didn't hit the satellite and not hit that hydrazine tank, because that would be just like shooting a bullet through a piece of drywall with no effect. All we would do basically is just generate some minor debris, but we would not affect the tank, and it would still re-enter, and that was the hazard, was the fuel in the tank. We wanted to use 3 different phenomenologies to make sure that we actually shot down and destroyed the hydrazine tank. The first was we had an airborne infrared sensor that was looking for infrared signatures and had a specific signature we were looking for a hydrazine cloud formation. In addition, we had radar traces. We wanted to make sure we intercepted this within the range, what we call the range radars in Hawaii, to be able to determine what that pattern would be. And we also had a spectrometer flying on an airborne asset as well to look for evidence and traces of hydrazine. Now, if you look at that middle row there in the picture, that non-lethal intercept where we hit the satellite and not the tank itself is what's represented by that far left picture there. Very thin stream of debris generated from that intercept. That's what the models and simulations predicted the screen would look like. If you look in the middle, that's also what our models and our simulations that we use in missile defense predicted that would look like if we hit the satellite and hit the tank. You see the fan that comes out of debris. And what you see there on the very far right there is the actual screenshot on the night of the intercept. That's what it looked like. So we had pretty good verification almost immediately that we, in fact, were able to shoot down, or that we had destroyed the hydrazine. Now, if you could come out and go to the video there, if you could, Mark, of the intercept, and we'll see that here. There we go. I think that's it. So the first thing you'll see here is the launch of the Standard Missile 3 from the Lake Erie. Here's the flyout. You'll see those pulses that we talked about. You'll see the staging, I'm sorry, of the interceptor, the first stage dropping off here shortly. And again, when we launched the interceptor, the ship itself, the radar and the fire control system, or the radar of the ship, had not been able to start that track determination. There's the staging that you see. This is from a high-flying aircraft as well, picking up these pictures. The first you're going to see is an infrared shot of the intercept itself, and we're looking for certain patterns in this to determine whether or not we hit the tank. And then you'll see electro-optical, otherwise just the visual of this, and you'll see what we were looking for is the formation of a hydrazine cloud, because we knew that when we hit the tank, we would get a formation, and you'll see in the bottom right-hand side, close to the center, you'll see like a half-moon shape will begin developing, coalesce. That's the cloud we were looking for. When we saw that, combined with the radar screen, combined with the spectrometer analysis, we were able to report to President Bush that we, in fact, had been successful. Now, if you go to the next slide, I often get asked, well, wait a minute, you know, what's the difference between the Chinese shooting down a satellite and what you guys did? Well, in my mind, there were big differences, very big differences. Number one, what the Chinese did back in January of 2007 was unannounced, and it was not a satellite that was posing a threat to anybody in terms of casualty on the Earth. They destroyed a weather satellite that was in polar orbit 530 miles above the Earth, 530 miles. We were down at 250 kilometers, so a little bit over 120 miles in altitude. Why that's important is the higher the altitude, the more debris you generate in the altitudes, in the altitude bands and in the orbital bands. According to General Kresge of Air Force Space Command, it was the largest debris-generating event in history. It increased about 20% the amount of debris that's in low Earth orbit. Now, the debris from this engagement with the Chinese is estimated to pose risk to some 800 satellites in low Earth orbit and the International Space Station, also to include additional space shuttle missions for the future for up to 100 years. That's based on the debris that was generated from that engagement. For Operation Burnt Frost, which was our satellite shoot down, number one, it was something that we had to do because we wanted to eliminate the risk to personnel on Earth. We intentionally tried to hit as low as we could to minimize debris. There was a problem, though, in terms of how low we could actually go, because as these satellites decay, they speed up on reentry, just basic orbital physics. And there's a limit in terms of the speed that we could handle to be able to shoot it down. So that was the trade we were trying to make, is to ensure that we hit it low enough to minimize debris, but high enough that we were still below our velocity limitations. Now, last couple of slides. What are some of the lessons learned from this? Well, I believe that there were a lot of questions that were answered in this. First of all, do we have the ability to quickly turn with this system in areas that we had not anticipated, and be able to modify and generate capability where we had none, especially in very short times? 6 weeks is just a flash of time here in the missile defense business. Were we able to generate and integrate capabilities on a national level, both strategically and operationally, to be able to pull this together? We demonstrated, I think, the value of the mobility of defenses. We also demonstrated the value of the integration of these capabilities together to extend more than you would have autonomously. And that is, I think, one of the biggest lessons learned. And if I could show you what that means to the missile defense system on the next slide. What you see here are two typical defended areas of ships that are off the coast of Japan in this case, or in Europe in the other case. Now, these are the defended areas that a ship would have operating autonomously. Now, if you go to the next slide, if we're able to integrate, in the case of Japan, a land-based radar located in Japan, or in the case of Europe, the Czech radar that we're proposing for the Czech Republic, you see the tremendous expansion of defended area that you get by tying those radars into the ships and being able to detect and then launch and get the full kinematic range of these interceptors. Next slide. Legal considerations. And we had a lot of deliberation in the interagency process about this, about what the legal considerations were. We wanted to make sure that we were adherent to all the treaties, and we carefully considered those. We strictly adhered to those as well. One thing to note with the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, we could not have done this. We could not have tied these, for example, land-based radars into the ship-based interceptors to affect this shoot-down. That would have been in violation of the treaty, and frankly, because of the existence of the treaty, we would not have done the engineering and all of the deployments necessary to be able to affect this overall. And lastly, I get asked a lot about the advantages of missile defense, and I'd like to just take one minute on this slide. We sometimes get painted as anti-arms control in missile defense, or anti-counterproliferation. Nothing could be farther than from the truth. I believe, as I said before, that if we field effective missile defenses, they can actually become a non-proliferation tool. They could incentivize countries not to invest in these weapons and proliferate them. We know that it bolsters deterrence. If you can enter some question into an attacker's mind as to what's going to be successful in their attack, it has a tendency to restrain them in their attack. We know that it provides leaders with another option other than preemption or retaliation. We saw that in the summer of 2006 when the North Koreans were stacking and launching missiles with no notice and being very aggressive about it. Some were calling for preemptive strikes against those sites. That would have been very destabilizing. The President relied on the missile defense to stabilize that situation. And as I said before, when all else fails and you have nothing to show except for what you can actually defend in terms of an inbound warhead, it's nice to have that option to shoot that down. I want to thank you very much for inviting me. I'll be happy to take any questions.
General, thank you very much, and congratulations to you and the captain of the Lake Erie and the whole team that pulled this off. This is really quite remarkable in the large numbers of agencies and individuals that were involved. Really quite a breakthrough and quite an heroic effort. We now have three panelists that will talk a little bit about the implications of the successful shoot-down. But since the ABM Treaty was mentioned, let me just give the audience a little bit of background on the ABM Treaty. This was a convention that was part of SALT I, concluded between the United States and the then Soviet Union in 1972, that initially banned all but 2 ground-based fixed sites of ABM on both sides of the Cold War divide. That was later cut down to 1 site lawfully on both sides, and then ultimately the United States simply unilaterally determined that it would not deploy at that point. The ABM treaty was ended for the United States. We withdrew from that treaty in 2002. So in essence, it had quite an influence in slowing down our ability to move forward in ABM systems for about 3 decades. It also had produced, during the 1980s, one of the greatest legal debates in the history of United States foreign policy at the time of Ronald Reagan's interest in space-based defense systems, and that became known as the so-called broad-narrow issue in relation to whether the treaty permitted the testing and development of mobile ABM systems based on so-called other physical principles, which simply meant lasers or particle beams. By the way, not even deployment. Everybody conceded that you could not deploy such systems under the ABM treaty, but it simply generated this debate about the question of testing and development. In a sense, and dealing with another one of the very important points that the General made, there was really kind of a religion that had attached to the ABM treaty in that period of time, a determination that in theory we would be better off in our strategic stability if what we saw was a complete limitation of ABM systems, but at the same time this dramatic escalation of warheads. So that by the end of this period of time in which we were making those judgments, we had something like 10,000 warheads that were roughly immediately deliverable against the United States of America, and the same thing against the Soviet Union at that time, without effective ABM systems. And I think today, after the end of the Cold War, we're certainly much better off, in which we've reversed that judgment and basically sought to limit more effectively warheads and to reduce the warheads very, very dramatically, and at the same time move forward with defense, with ballistic missile defense systems. Let me also just make one other point, since I had at one point, as part of a study for the Arms Control Agency, personally interviewed most of those that were involved in the original ABM decisions. Let me just say that one of the considerations of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in accepting the original ABM treaty is that at that time, back in 1972, the United States only had the ability to shoot down missiles by exploding nuclear warheads in the atmosphere. Now, if those are your choices, you can obviously see that this is not something that's good. So I think it is critically important that we understand today, as the General indicated, that we are dealing solely with systems that are basically kinetic kill vehicles. They have no explosives. They're simply running into the system to knock it down. And that's just completely different and very important. And I personally do think that the newer post-Cold War assessment, in which we are supportive of moving forward with ABM systems, at the same time that we work very actively both to limit the number of warheads and also, particularly importantly, to keep nuclear warheads and nuclear material out of the hands of terrorists. With that very brief introduction for our audience on some of the ABM parts of this, I'd like now to turn to our first panelist, who is Dr. Robert L. Pfaltzgraff, Professor Pfaltzgraff, who is President of the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis, Chairman of the National Security Planning Associates, and Shelby Colum Davis Professor of International Security Studies at the Fletcher School, Tufts University, and he currently serves on the International Security Advisory Board of the United States Department of State. Professor Pfaltzgraff.
Thank you very much, John. It is a great pleasure and privilege to be here today and also to benefit from General Obering's outstanding remarks at the beginning of our session. I wanted to say a few things about the implications of the shoot-down for space missile defense and space in general, space policy and the role of space in U.S. national security policy in general. The February 2008 intercept of the failed U.S. satellite that we've heard a good deal about already this afternoon was, of course, a remarkable event. It was not designed as a test, but instead as an effort to eliminate a toxic hazard, hydrazine, that was descending toward Earth. Unlike the secrecy surrounding the Chinese launch a year earlier, the United States announced well in advance what it planned to do and how it was going to go about doing this. To do so, of course, we reprogrammed, as we've heard, the guidance system of the Standard Missile-3 interceptor that was designed to target slower and lower missiles. This provides additional evidence that the SM-3 can not only do what it did to the satellite, but that it can certainly perform, as we've seen in so many of the successful tests that have been undertaken, the missile intercept missions for which it was designed. The impact of the intercept destroyed the target, as we've heard, at an altitude of about 130 miles above the Pacific Ocean. The intercept, I might add, vaporized the half-ton of toxic rocket fuel and incinerated vaporized debris as it fell harmlessly to Earth. In most quarters, this remarkable achievement was welcomed as evidence of the success of our sea-based missile defense systems and, of course, as a good omen for the future. The Navy missile launched from the USS Lake Erie, and we have the captain of the USS Lake Erie here this afternoon, collided head-on with the 2.3 metric ton USA-193, which was the designation of the satellite. And it did so, as one official put it, quote, operating at the margins of a system well engineered for a different job, end of quote. The achievement demonstrated by the shoot-down was a dramatic indication of the technological advances that have been made in recent years to achieve kinetic intercepts. That is, as General Obering pointed out, to hit a bullet with a bullet. Nowhere have these achievements been greater than in the Aegis missile defense program. Now, in thinking about this presentation this afternoon, these remarks, I thought for a moment about what might have happened if we had decided simply to allow the satellite to descend to Earth, as some of the critics have suggested, given the admittedly low probability of death or destruction from the hydrazine tank. Was it a 3.5 chance, or a 1 in 25 to 1 in 45 chance? And I've seen various estimates about how low the probability might have been. Some might say that this is a case for doing nothing and simply hoping that the satellite's toxic material would incinerate as it descended, or even if it reached the Earth, would not do any damage. However, the successful intercept obviously reduced to zero whatever risk there may have been. And again, think for a moment of the criticism that would have been heaped on the United States had there been deaths or destruction from our satellite, and had we done nothing to prevent it from reaching the Earth's surface. Critics could justifiably have asked what we had gotten for our large missile defense investment over the years if we could not deal with this satellite. There would also have been invidious comparisons with the successful Chinese direct ascent launch in January 2007. The U.S. failure would also have been seen as evidence of the limitations of missile defense technologies and vindication of those who are skeptical of its ability to operate effectively when we need it, missile defense. The failure of the intercept itself or our failure to attempt even to intercept the satellite would have been welcomed furthermore by America's enemies. This would have been portrayed as evidence of the deficiencies of U.S. technology and might well have emboldened those who do not wish us well. What is remarkable, however, is how critics who acknowledge the success of the intercept have sometimes chosen to interpret it as evidence of a large top-secret space program that will lead to a military race in space. At the same time, they discounted the official motivation as simply wanting to destroy the dead satellite. That's too simple an explanation, they have said. Instead, the intercept was alleged to be a subterfuge to test U.S. space weapons. It was seen as a U.S. response to China's ASAT test a year earlier and as the tip of the iceberg that is the allegedly covert, clandestine U.S. space weapons program. One can only wish, as I do, that such a program existed. And if it does, we can all be very grateful. But whether or not it exists, there is little that can be done to prevent other countries from militarizing or weaponizing space, because that, in a sense, is what this critics' debate is all about. The heart of the argument by those who oppose the militarization or weaponization of space is that the United States, by entering international treaties, for example, can somehow set the standards that others will follow. I would argue that this neglects the simple fact that we were not the first to militarize space. This happened, incidentally, when Nazi Germany launched its V-2 rockets against targets in southern England beginning in June or July of 1944, and, of course, when the Soviet Union launched its first Sputnik in October 1957. Furthermore, the Chinese ASAT launch in January 2007 provided evidence that the weaponization of space can take place from the Earth or in space itself. China launched a direct ascent missile from its own territory that detonated in close proximity to a Chinese satellite. We must assume that China is also developing the means to target large numbers of satellites, our own included, in what can only be called the weaponization of space Chinese style. How to ban such a capability would be a severe challenge indeed for the designers of an arms control treaty for space, if only for the impossibility of verification and the difficulty inherent in efforts even to define what is a space weapon. So I would simply ask, and we'll perhaps address this in discussion later, when is space weaponized? Because weapons can be launched from Earth into space, but weapons can also be launched from space against targets in space or on Earth. Now this brings me to yet another point or two that I want to make, and that is to come back to China for a moment here. The 2008 version of the Pentagon's Military Power of China, which is issued, of course, on an annual basis, discusses Beijing's use of what is called legal warfare, designed to shape U.S. and other approaches to space. Legal warfare, as practiced by China, and as discussed in this 2008 report, includes, and I quote directly from it, the use of international and domestic laws to gain international support and manage possible political repercussions of China's military actions. China has incorporated its legal warfare concept into its attempts to shape international opinion, end of quote. What this means is that China seeks to divert the United States from developing space capability, while China, with in this case the support also from Russia, continues its programs to exploit U.S. vulnerabilities and to establish China as a leading space power in the decades ahead. Now, although there is fortunately growing bipartisan agreement about the importance of continuing to fund Aegis, and this is very good, the same cannot be said about space as an arena for missile defense. Because the satellite shoot-down took place in the beginning, at least, of the low Earth orbit altitude, it brought back the discussion of space militarization and weaponization, as I've already suggested. The U.S. destruction of the dead satellite, together with China's launch in early 2000 that could place at risk vital U.S. space-based assets, should have reminded us that for the United States, space represents an indispensable first line of defense. These events also serve as a reminder that the United States is already facing challengers to its position in space. Many other countries have space programs, and there is a burgeoning private sector space endeavor in many parts of the world. We should also understand that space technologies are inherently dual use. The spread of technologies for launching satellites and other payloads into and through space is creating new opportunities in the commercial sector as well as military applications. And of course, now to draw to a conclusion my remarks, I would want to reiterate that the successful U.S. shootdown earlier this year highlights the importance of missile defense and, of course, the successes of the Aegis program. But it also points up the importance of space. The intercept, while spectacularly successful, highlights the need to bear in mind yet another consideration. While a single sea-based interceptor destroyed a satellite, and I know others could have been used if the first had not succeeded, the limited missile defenses now being deployed may face, as we move out into the next decade, penetration aids and/or warheads. Therefore, more than one interceptor may be required for confidence in the destruction of a single warhead. We will need to develop, as I know is well understood in the Missile Defense Agency, greater robustness in our missile defenses in the years ahead. We will also need to give more attention to boost phase capabilities, including sea-based systems. However, a boost phase defense that is space-based could always be on station on a worldwide basis, unhampered by sovereignty issues of overflight and operations on another nation's territory. An advanced sea-based system could provide boost and descent phase capability as well, but this will depend on the launch site and the ship's position in the world today. Only a space-based system could provide a truly global missile defense intercept capability, contributing thereby, I would argue, to a layered, multi-tiered, robust missile defense that we will need in the future. However, far from a large clandestine space weapons program, as some of the critics may have alleged, I fear that we are unable even to agree on the modest funding that is necessary for a space-based test bed for missile defense, and instead we have limited ourselves to an even more modest, but for this we should be grateful, $5 million appropriation that has just been attached to the DoD appropriations continuing resolution for FY09 to study space-based interceptors. For this we should be grateful, of course. But in point of fact, as I look back, it seems to me that we had solved crucially important technology programs, technology problems associated with space-based interceptors nearly a generation ago in the Brilliant Pebbles system. Nevertheless, the good news is that we are moving forward with Aegis, and we've seen its demonstrated success. The bad news is that we are still using increasingly obsolescent political arguments, such as those that came about during the ABM treaty period, to constrain technological opportunities offered by space for necessary missile defense. Nevertheless, and I conclude on this point, the February shootdown of the dead U.S. satellite demonstrated what can be done and how far we've come toward doing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pfaltzgraff. Our second panelist is Vice Admiral J.D. Williams, United States Navy, retired. Admiral Williams was the former Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Naval Warfare and the former commander of the United States Sixth Fleet. He is, in many respects, the father of ABM defense in the United States Navy. Admiral Williams.
Thank you for the introduction. There's been a lot of criticism and support and opposition to the shoot down, but from my perspective, let me say, if I was going to design a test, although it was not a test, I could not have designed a better one to demonstrate what I have been trying to tell people for a number of years, and I'll get into that. One, it was probably the fastest, at least one of the fastest targets we've ever shot down. At 6.8 kilometers per second. That's moving out. Again, the ship was the system is operationally ready. The captain's here. He can tell you better than I, but since I was also a commanding officer of a submarine, the crew knows what they're doing. It's their home. Of all systems in the Navy or in the services, there's no system that people know better than when they have to live on it as a home, and that's the ship. The crew is ready. It's part of their basic mission to shoot missiles at whatever the captain gets told to shoot missiles at. So again, it was proof that it was operational ready. Had very hefty designs or margins in the design of the missile. Remember, this missile was not designed to shoot down ICBMs or satellites even. It was designed to shoot down a lesser range missile. But as many engineers know, or many as you know, when you design a system, engineers like to make sure they put at least the minimum margin of design in that missile. And clearly the SM-3 has far exceeded what many of us ever thought it would do, and we thought it was going to be great. But it has the capability even to be greater, which was shown in the SM-3 shootdown, or the satellite shootdown. The system reliability, because of the crew, and I have done some work with Raytheon. I worked for different companies on different things. But I want to tell you, the Standard Missile for aircraft, I was amazed at one time in the Navy, if you pull the trigger and launched a missile, you were surprised if it shot down the aircraft. With the Standard missiles, it completely reversed that wise tale. If you fired the missile and you didn't shoot down the aircraft, that's when you got surprised because of the reliability of the Standard missile. And believe me, the SM-3 is a continuation of that robust design and exceeding the minimum design requirements in the missile. So I don't think there's any doubt that that's a reliable missile. In fact, the reliability has even surprised me because that was out of 16 attempts, that was the 14th success, including the satellite. And it's been consistent reliability over a period of ever since we've been tested now for 4 or 5 years. And we're building, thanks to Congress, we are building, I can't get into exact numbers, but at least a couple of hundred more SM-3 missiles. So there's going to be not enough, not as many as the Navy or I would like, but at least more than we did have before we were building more missiles, thanks to Congress and General Obering for funding those missiles. I have known for years that the SM-3 missile had ICBM capability and briefed both General Cadis and General Obering of that fact. And it wasn't just J.D. Williams figuring that out in the back of his garage. I had some experts in the field like MIT Lincoln Lab and Raytheon assisting in that effort to demonstrate just what the capability of that missile was. The SM-3 can also defend Hawaii if we choose to do that. And that's still being considered by General Obering and the Missile Defense Agency. Since the SM-3 has now demonstrated that it can operate or handle a target in the ICBM regime, I recommend that MDA modify their test program to establish the limits of the SM-3 capability. In other words, what is the maximum range missile that the SM-3 can shoot down? You'd be using similar to what General Obering briefed on the satellite. I call it an engagement remote, but there's other names for it. But it is using an off-board range from another radar, land-based, space-based, whatever it is, to feed that into the fire control system of the missile. Just like in this case, the Lake Erie shot the missile before the radar had the target. That would be the standard procedure, and I think General Obering now supports that concept, and it's being worked on. But using that guidance method that they use to shoot down a satellite, and I think the test will prove to be successful. And if it does prove to be successful, then I'd recommend that the Aegis BMD system, along with the SM-3, be plugged into the homeland defense as a backup to the ground base. Again, no matter how good one system is, it never hurts to have a backup. And I think it's certainly a definite possibility. Also, with the approved development of the SM-3 Block II missile, which is recognized of having ICBM capability, there are some promising architectures for defense for the homeland, Europe, and the Middle East, and for that matter, any other ally that we have, where you have a sea-based defense defending large areas using the Block II missile. And hopefully, as we get into the additional test, also the Block I missile. In fact, with a strategically placed X-band radar at the right area, it could defend a lot, or it could solve a lot of, apolitically, it could solve many of our, or at least some of our defense problems now, such in Europe, the Middle East, and other places. So I think there's a great possibility ahead for the sea-based system, and I've always supported, as General Obering will tell you, hopefully, I've always supported ground-based, I've supported THAAD, but we need a team effort for a layered defense for different ranges, because we never know what we may have to do with that system, just as we found out with the shoot down of the satellite. So with the great work, and I commend General Obering and his people and the Navy and all those who helped, including Congress, of plussing up the of the Aegis. At that time, we called it the upper tier system over the years before DOD and others got interested in the system, because we wouldn't have it now if we had not had all those plus-ups 10 or 15 years ago to have the system. So a lot of effort by a lot of people working hard, we now have one of the better systems in the world for ballistic missile defense. And I'll be happy to answer questions later on if you happen to have any.
Thank you very much, Admiral. Our last panelist, before we open it up to some discussion among the panelists and then to question and answer from the audience, is Professor Robert F. Turner, who is the Associate Director of the Center for National Security Law at the University of Virginia. Indeed, Bob co-founded that center with me back in 1981. He holds both a professional and academic doctorate from the University of Virginia School of Law, and had very distinguished government service in a number of different areas, including having served as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Legislative Affairs. Bob Turner.
Thank you, John, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here. My role is to put things in a legal context. We've talked about the importance of ballistic missile defense. We've had a little bit of talking, just making the point that nothing we've done in this area is in violation of the law. I'm going to spend just a few minutes and take you through the regime of legal treaties that affect this area. I'm going to talk about two treaties that actually don't affect it, but they're nevertheless perhaps important. One used to be very important, and we withdrew from it. First, I want to start off, though, by congratulating General Obering and Captain Hendrickson, who's here with his lovely wife and his son, for truly a remarkable achievement. This is, I remember not too many years ago, it's been probably at least 15 years, when I heard the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I think in testimony before Congress, say, "You'll never be able to hit a bullet with a bullet." And as I listened to that, I said, you know what, anybody who bets against American ingenuity is taking a very risky gamble. He was wrong. I'm glad he was wrong. And the people who proved that, once again, are in the room with us here today and deserve our gratitude. The Navy likes to say, bravo, Zulu. I taught at the Naval War College for a year, and I picked that up there. But for you civilians in the audience, it means well done. Now, let's talk a little bit about I'm going to start off with a brief overview of existing law, talk a little bit about existing legal constraints on space-based ballistic missile defense, and finally, earlier this year, the Russians and Chinese placed before the Committee on Disarmament of the United Nations a new treaty, which they've done several times before. Indeed, I think the Chinese have been doing this since the 1980s, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what it says and what I see as some of its shortcomings. If you start off with treaties regulating our behavior in military activities, I think the first thing you have to start off with is a UN Charter, which we'll talk about briefly. We have the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty from 1963, which is still in force, and we are a party, although unless we start testing nuclear weapons in space, it's not going to be a factor. We have the Outer Space Treaty from 1967, which is very much in force. We are a party, and it does place some constraints on what we might want to do, but not on anything that I gather anybody is talking about doing, so I don't think it's going to be much of a constraint either. There exists a sort of a follow-up to the Outer Space Treaty called the Moon Treaty that, as I recall, has 11 state parties as members, none of whom have any chance of launching anything into space in my lifetime. All the big guys, the big players, have stayed away from it, and but I'll talk about it just very briefly. And I'll also talk briefly about the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. A few years ago, I did a short book called The ABM Treaty in the Senate. This is back when it was in force, talking about a lot of legal issues, including how to get rid of it. Before I talk about treaties, I want to make one point about the nature of international law itself. It is a permissive regime. That is to say, you know, do you have to find a rule of international law that says you can do something, or do you have to find a rule of international law that says you can't do something? And the Permanent Court of International Justice in 1927 addressed this issue and said that restrictions upon the independence of states cannot therefore be presumed. In other words, if there is not a rule of international law, either a treaty to which we have consented to be bound, or a rule of conventional international law that we have recognized represents a binding legal obligation, we are not bound by international law in this area. Now, in the UN Charter, the most relevant provision is Article 2.4, a very important provision. All members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. What that basically means is you can't launch aggressive wars. You can't act aggressively. You can't threaten aggression. As long as we are acting defensively, which is what this program is about, Article 2.4 should not present a problem. The 1963 Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, we promised not to carry out any nuclear weapons test explosions or any other nuclear explosions in any place other basically than underground, and specifically including in outer space. Again, nobody is talking about testing nuclear weapons in outer space, so that's not a problem today. The most important treaty today is the Outer Space Treaty, which was concluded in 1967. It has 98 parties. There are another 25 or 30 countries that have signed but not ratified, which means they've accepted an obligation not to defeat the object or purpose of the treaty, either until they ratify or give notice they don't intend to ratify. Article 4 of the treaty prohibits or commits us not to place in orbit around the Earth any object carrying nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction, or to install such weapons on celestial bodies, to station such weapons in outer space, and also it says that the moon and other celestial bodies shall be used for peaceful purposes. We'll talk about what that means in a few minutes. Continuing on, Article 4 says the establishment of military bases, installations, fortifications, the testing of weapons, or the conduct of maneuvers on celestial bodies shall be forbidden. Presumably we're talking primarily about the moon, but there could be asteroids or even Mars at some point in the future. That treaty is very much in force. We are a party to it. President Johnson ratified it October 10th, 1967. Now, we hear the word peaceful purposes, and sadly there are some people that look at people in uniform and think, well, he obviously is not in the business of peace. I grew up as a sack brat, and my father was an Army Air Corps and later Air Force physician. I remember driving on base and seeing a Strategic Air Command sign that said, "Peace is our profession." I can't think of anything that we do in this country that better preserves peace than the job of our men and women in uniform who go out and tell the bad people out there, if you start wars, the Americans are going to cause you an awful lot of pain. It has kept the peace remarkably in my lifetime, and anybody who sees people in uniform and doesn't understand they are peace forces is misguided, I think. Now, the term peaceful purposes appears 4 times in the Outer Space Treaty and in other treaties as well. For 50 years, it's been the position of the United States, and the Soviet Union also embraced that position, that what peaceful purposes means is non-aggressive purposes. You can't use the space for purposes of aggression, just as you don't need this treaty. You've got the UN Charter that already prohibits the aggressive use of force. It's true in space, it's true in the air, it's true on the ground, it's true at sea. Indeed, Article 88 of the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention specifically provides that the high seas shall be reserved for peaceful purposes. Now, does that mean you can't put warships on the high seas? You can't fire missiles in the high seas? You can't even engage in defensive war on the high seas? I submit not. So when you see the word peaceful purposes, don't be misled into meaning that means the military can't be involved. Now, the Moon Treaty entered into force in 1984. It has 11 parties. Again, neither the U.S. nor any other player is a party to it, and it doesn't bind anyone involved in the business of space. The United States, Russia, China, all the other players have just basically ignored it, so it has no force as customary international law as well. But just for the record, it prohibits not placing in orbit around the Earth any object carrying nuclear weapons or other WMD, or installing such weapons on celestial bodies, or stationing such weapons in outer space in any manner. The moon and celestial bodies shall be used by state parties for peaceful purposes. Again, no military bases, no installations and fortifications, testing, and so forth. But again, this is not really a factor. Now, although it's not in force anymore, I should probably talk a little bit about the anti-ballistic, or the ABM treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty that was ratified by the United States in 1972. Article 5 provides that each party undertakes not to develop, test, or deploy ABM systems or components which are sea-based, air-based, space-based, or mobile land-based. As General Obering mentioned, this would have caused some problems for our recent, for the February 20th shoot-down. Article 15 of the treaty provides that either party on 6-month notice can withdraw from the treaty. On December 13, 2001, President Bush gave notice that the United States was withdrawing from the treaty, which took effect 6 months later on June 13, 2001. So, in summary, today we cannot do any nuclear testing in outer space. We cannot put weapons of mass destruction in Earth orbit. We cannot put weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons, on celestial bodies, the moon, what have you. We cannot station WMD in outer space. We can't have military bases, maneuvers, and the like on celestial bodies. And again, the most fundamental principle, we cannot use force aggressively in outer space any more than we can on the Earth. Now, I mentioned the Russians and the Chinese recently released a new space treaty on February 13th of this year. It's called the Draft Treaty on the Prevention of the Placement of Weapons in Outer Space, the Threat or Use of Force Against Outer Space Objects, abbreviated PPWT. It's the latest in a series of proposals for many years joined in by the the Russians and the Chinese. It's obviously one of their big goals is to make sure the United States doesn't go forward with any kind of a ballistic missile defense program that might devalue their offensive systems, although the reality is we are probably not going to consider any kind of a ballistic missile defense program that would fully protect us against the entire inventory of Russian nuclear missiles. I may be wrong on that, but that would be a much broader undertaking than what we're doing. Mostly what we're doing, as I understand it, is giving ourselves the ability that if the North Koreans, the Iranians, or some other group got a small number of missiles and tried to blackmail us with them, their blackmail would have no effect because they would know that we have the ability to shoot their missiles down before they hit New York or Washington or even Charlottesville. Who can be against peace? This is one of those things that I could see a large number of members of Congress being told, oh yes, this is a treaty to stop an arms race in space, and signing up for it. And one of the reasons I like to see public discussion of these issues is to make it clear these are very complex issues. It's not about which side is for peace, it's about which course of action is better going to preserve the peace. We're all for peace. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you're dealing with the Russians or the Chinese is that their current leaders are all old-line Leninists. And Lenin taught that you make agreements with your enemies in order to weaken them. And the Soviets during the, particularly during the 1970s, were absolutely brilliant at conning us into signing agreements that were so vague, so imprecise, that we couldn't hold them to much of anything. And yet, because the ambiguity could mean fairly strict restrictions, our Congress was going to ensure that we didn't violate the broadest possible effect of this. I remember when the SALT I agreement, the Soviets had the SS-9, their big ICBM, and we had an American declaration that said that increasing a missile by more than, I think it was 70 or 80% would be a violation, and they brought out the SS-18, which increased it basically by that percentage in length and width, and brought a whole new level of threat to the table. We couldn't hold them to it because it was ambiguous agreements, and we had unilateral American statements we were trying to use to define it. And so when we're dealing particularly with former Leninists, we need to be very careful, read the language carefully, make sure the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed, and the like. The general, or no, I think Bob made reference to using law as a means of struggle. It's what some of us call lawfare. It's not necessarily good or bad. We do it. In fact, my colleague John Norton Moore has been involved in a lawsuit against the government of Iraq for the torture and abuse of American POWs back during Operation Desert Storm, using civil litigation. In fact, our center has been at the forefront of promoting using civil litigation against the forces of darkness to hold them accountable, to make them pay a cost for this kind of stuff. But we learned, for example, from the Manchester document, when an Al-Qaeda cell was broken in Manchester, England, and they found on a computer basically an Al-Qaeda training manual, and one of the things it said is if you're arrested, as soon as you go to court, scream that you were tortured. Say you were not Al-Qaeda, and so on and so on. This is common, and we're going to see, I think, more lawsuits in our own legal system and so forth as tools of struggle. It's important we understand that, and that we look carefully at the facts when we hear charges that Americans are committing war crimes and so forth. Now, let me be clear on this. I'm not saying that waterboarding is not a war crime. I happen to believe it is. But there are a lot of other things out there where charges are going to be made against us involving the law that, upon careful examination, I think you're going to find are lawfare and are, in fact, not based on truth. Now, let's go back to the new treaty. It defines a weapon in outer space. It says it means any device placed in outer space based on any physical principle which has been specially produced or converted to destroy, damage, or disrupt the normal functioning of objects in outer space on the Earth or in the Earth's atmosphere, or to eliminate a population or component of the biosphere which are important to human existence or inflict damage on them. Fairly broad terms, I guess. I guess I want to ask, who decides what the purpose was, or whether it has been specially produced for that purpose, and so forth. For example, there are a lot of dual-use items that might be used in an anti-ballistic missile, or sorry, in an anti-satellite role, but also might have another function as well. You can launch a weather satellite, and if you aim it to impact another country's satellite, it's just become an anti-satellite weapon. And deciding in advance when it goes up, in fact, deciding what happened to your satellite may be a problem. Satellites sometimes malfunction, and if all of a sudden your satellite stops working, was it hit by the Chinese or by the Russians, or was it did a wire short out or something like that? There's a serious problem here, and again, trying to establish another country's purpose in deploying a device in space is going to be a difficult task. Article 6 says, with a view of promoting confidence in compliance with the provisions of the treaty and ensuring transparency and confidence building in outer space activities, the state parties shall implement agreed confidence building measures on a voluntary basis. Great treaty. We'll agree that anything we agree on in the future we can do. And Article 6 goes on. Measures to verify compliance with the treaty may form the subject of an additional protocol someday. Sign up first, and then we'll talk about whether we're going to be able to verify this treaty. Again, this reads more, as somebody who studied Leninism for many years, this is just a classic, almost meaningless effort to limit us, because they know we will generally obey the rules, because we know if we don't, our Senate, our Congress will be screaming, why are you violating the rules? Anyway, and then there's Article 10. Any state party may propose amendments to this treaty. Any amendment to this treaty shall be approved by a majority of the votes of the state parties. So if we join the treaty, then a majority of the parties, without our consent or even consulting us, gets to change the treaty any way they want. It's an interesting process. I just can't imagine that one of the things, it has a 6-month renunciation provision. But what if after we join it, a majority of the parties decide to say, no, it's now permanent? Well, are we now locked into a permanent treaty? It's an interesting issue. I don't know. But again, does anybody really think 2/3 of the United States Senate is going to consent to the ratification of a treaty that contains no verification provisions, allows a simple majority of foreigners to foreign nations to change the terms of the treaty at any time as they will? I don't think this is going to stop anything the Chinese or Russians want to do, and I just can't imagine this has got much of a future, but again, I could be wrong. I've already talked about a couple of problems with the treaty. It has no provision for effective verification, but it says we may agree on those in the future. Our obligations can be changed by a simple majority. The White House spokesman noted that any object orbiting or transiting through space can be a weapon if the object is intentionally placed into a collision course with another space object. This makes treaty verification impossible. Perhaps that's why they said if we want to talk about verification, we can do that later. Now, China already has the capability to shoot down satellites. We know that. We saw that. Again, on Friday, January 29th of last year, a Chinese FY-1C ballistic missile shot down a Chinese weather satellite that wasn't posing any threat to anyone, but they wanted to show us we have an ASAT capability. And, of course, they spread out about 150,000 pieces of deadly space debris that may be knocking down other people's satellites for the next century or so. Now, Chinese military journals have very openly talked about space warfare. I don't have access to classified information, but I've read accounts in unclassified sources that the British were playing with a nanosatellite technology, a tiny, almost fountain pen size device that could be secretly attached to another country's satellites in space, undetected, and upon demand could destroy that satellite. The British got tired of funding it, and then the people involved in it apparently went to work for the Chinese. I don't know, maybe they're using to paint houses or something, but the technology is at least a potential technology is there. They literally could put small barnacles on the side of our satellites, and then just when things got difficult in some negotiation, they could push a button and say, oh, whoops, all your satellites have just gone bad. I wonder, must be sunspots or something like that. Now, a point I'm not sure I've heard mentioned, but I think it's tremendously important. We are tremendously vulnerable as a country on space-based assets. I was an infantry recon platoon leader in the Army in the 1960s. I could read a map very well. The sense I get, and I may be wrong on this, is that the young infantry officers today are getting a few hours of, this is how they used to do it in the dark ages when they had a map and compass, but here's your system that gets GPS signals and tells you exactly where you are. If those GPS satellites came down, I think there's going to be an awful lot of on-the-job learning how to read a map and so forth, and it's going to make a lot of problems. Most of our most effective systems involve satellites. We've just seen this, how a satellite on one ship can provide information to another ship that can launch a missile even before it picks up the target on its own radar. This is all dependent upon those satellites being secure. If we do not have the ability to keep them secure, I think they're going to be our Achilles heel, and our adversaries are going to say, if we need to shut down the American military, the most important thing is to develop the ability to knock out their satellites. And again, if we make no effort to defend our population, we provide an incentive for rogue states to build ICBMs and nuclear weapons. I thought that the General's point was exactly right. If we develop this system, then the bad guys are going to say, well, we have the potential, the ability to develop to procure 4 or 5 nuclear missiles we can launch at the Americans, but if we did that, they'd just shoot them down. So let's spend our money on a new golf course for the people or something like that. So in terms of providing incentives for peaceful behavior, having the ability to deal with this kind of a threat, I think, is going to provide a disincentive for the development of that particular threat. Now, in February of 2000, China placed a working paper down at the Disarmament Conference of the UN stating that a new outer space treaty should create an obligation, and I quote, not to test, deploy, or use weapons, weapon systems, or components. Now, if we're talking about banning components in outer space, in return for a treaty that I don't think buys us very much, we are going to have to give up a lot. Just for example, we have GPS. I've got, I think, 3 of them, different cars, handheld one for kayaking. They're absolutely wonderful. GPS was designed to be a guidance system for our airplanes, missiles, and so forth. It was originally developed by the military as a weapons system. If we ban all weapons in space, including components of weapons, and if you just say the entire weapons system has to be up there, if somebody's got a button to push on the ground, apparently it won't be covered. If we ban the weaponization of space, we're probably going to need to shut down our GPS system. And that means that next time somebody has a heart attack in your house and you call 911, it may take them an extra 10 minutes to find the map and find out where you live. There are tremendous benefits that we get in this country because of GPS. Is it worth giving up for what they're talking about? And again, in wartime, I worked in the Senate for 5 years back in the 70s, and I listened as people complained about we don't need B-1 bombers, we don't need Abrams tanks, we don't need the long-range cruise missiles, stuff that was just in the infancy in those days, but it's served us well in the last 15 or 20 years. These weapons are very useful for promoting the rule of law and for minimizing collateral damage in wartime. We have the ability to strike with such precision that you don't have to have the kind of, slaughter that we saw in Dresden and Tokyo and so forth, where they were using gravity bombs. They dropped the bomb, they did a couple of prayers, and then saw where they hit. If we take away the ability of our missiles, of our planes, of our submarines and so forth, to use this technology, we're certainly going to have an awful lot more collateral damage in wartime. What about weather satellites? Many of our space-based assets are dual purpose. If they've got a military purpose and knowing the weather is pretty important to military people, then maybe they ought to come down because they'll be a component of a military system. What about our, the next major hurricane? Well, if we take down our satellites, we're not going to know exactly when it's coming or what direction. What's the cost of that going to be? The point is there's an awful lot of space technology that has a military purpose, a very important military purpose, that if banned would also lose its non-military purpose, and some of those things are things that help us very much as Americans in peacetime and in wartime. Conclusions: existing rules of international law don't preclude the U.S. from developing an effective ballistic missile defense system, even one that is space-based, so long as weapons are not based on celestial objects and no WMD are based in space. Nobody's talking about either one of those. Whether we should spend the money to protect our citizens is obviously a policy question ultimately to be decided by Congress because, as everybody knows, under Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, no money can be taken out of the Treasury except by appropriation made by law. So the policy issues we'll leave to Congress, but the legal issues clearly are not going to be a problem for the kind of programs that we're talking about at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. Just a couple of points before seeing if our panelists would like to add anything to what they've heard before we open it up to the audience. One is that we've heard a number of important reasons for ABM systems. One of those that we've discussed certainly is that of the threat of rogue states. North Korea, for example, Iran, which seems to be seeking to obtain nuclear materials. But in addition to that, I think we sometimes forget about the importance of having a defense against unauthorized or accidental launch. There are a lot of ICBMs out there in the world, and it would be an enormous tragedy if you had a setting in which a missile somewhere was simply accidentally launched or launched through unauthorized action, not intended by the country at all, and yet you had no ability to take it down and to save your population from a perfectly terrible catastrophe. Second point, I'd like to just follow up a point that Bob made as to why the Outer Space Treaty's language on peaceful purposes does not ban military activities. It is solely a ban that parallels that of the United Nations Charter, that you cannot engage in aggressive activities. It does not ban defensive activities. And how do we know that? Well, one of the reasons we know that is a newer treaty that uses exactly the same language. The 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea basically clearly has been interpreted as not banning military activities. Just to give you an example, I was one of the ambassadors involved in that, and I can tell you that the United States, at the time this language was agreed, made a clear statement for the record that it did not ban military activities. Secondly, there is a statement on the record from the United Nations Secretary General stating the same thing. And third, just ask yourself the point, with a treaty with over 140 countries in the world in it, and warships all over the high seas, do you really believe seriously that anyone interprets that language as somehow banning military activities? And it means the same thing in the Outer Space Treaty that it does in the Law of the Sea Treaty. Final point, we've had a discussion briefly from Bob Pfaltzgraff and Bob Turner about legal warfare or lawfare, sometimes call that. I think it is very important to note, however, that the rule of law is of essential importance for democracies, a core difference between democratic nations and totalitarian non-democratic nations. This is our enormous strength. We are the leader of the democratic nations and of the free world, and the rule of law is a core of that strength, and I'm delighted that it's been embraced generally by our leadership on a nonpartisan basis through at least 2 presidencies at this point. Yes, you do need to differentiate between good and bad law. And the kind of convention that Bob was talking about that's been put on the table deliberately to try to constrain certain activities of the United States is obviously not a good treaty. You don't enter into it. On the other hand, something like the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, that the Joint Chiefs of Staff have over and over again said is essential for the United States of America, is precisely the other side where you want to differentiate. So this is not something that says somehow America should turn its back to the rule of law. It's just the opposite. This is our point of leadership. This is part of our greatness. And it's simply a matter of differentiating, of course, between good and bad law. Let me open it up at this point to our panelists. And General, anything at all? Okay, we'll follow the order. Bob?
I think we ought to hear from the audience.
Okay, well, Admiral?
Same.
And Bob, anything else you'd add? All right. It is open to questions and answers from the floor at this point. Yes, sir. Back here.
Yes, Al Milliken, American Independent Writers. What communication has taken place regarding missile defense with our NATO and other allies since February? And perhaps more significantly, what has transpired with China and Russia, as well as with, for example, India, Pakistan, and Israel in particular?
All right, a number of different questions there. General, would you like to take that?
Yes, sir. Thank you. First of all, we directly with NATO. I personally went to NATO in the spring and talked about the shoot down, the satellite shoot down in February. Gave some details about the rationale, the technical implications, and the capabilities, and why and how we did this. By the way, just a note, we have continually been briefing NATO on our overall missile defense program. I personally have briefed the NATO Council probably at least a half a dozen times or more in the last several years. I briefed the NATO-Russia Council at least 3 or 4 times over the last several years, including our planned deployments of sites in Poland and the Czech Republic. We've also been engaged with the Russians on a bilateral basis with missile defense in negotiations going back almost the entire time of my tenure in the Missile Defense Agency, which is 4.5 years. And before that, my predecessor had actually some cooperative programs with the Russians that they were engaged with. With respect to our other allies for the satellite shoot down, there was a notification that went out from the State Department on the rationale, some of the details of what we were doing and why, primarily, and that was very widespread, disseminated across the globe.
Could I add?
Yes, I'm sorry, Bob.
Just to add 1 or 2 points to your question, to the answer about NATO. First of all, the Bucharest summit that NATO held in April of this year gave a rather strong endorsement for missile defense, including the sites in the Czech Republic, the radar site in the Czech Republic, and the interceptor site in Poland. Secondly, there have been numerous discussions within NATO itself, including studies that have been done and that are ongoing about the internetting of the missile defense capabilities that will be developed as part of a NATO architecture for missile defense in the years ahead. I had the privilege to be at a conference in April, at the beginning of May, in Prague, that was held in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the actual building of the ministry, which included statements by the Secretary General of NATO, by the Foreign Minister of the Czech Republic, etc., and many other people. And it was a strong endorsement of missile defense. So the point I would make here is that there is very substantial NATO-European interest in and support for missile defense, including the defense against short-range missiles that many people in Europe look at as important, very important, but also as important in the case of the longer-range missiles, including the threat that may come from a country such as Iran in years ahead. So that's just an addendum to what General Obering has said.
Yes, sir.
I came in late, so I apologize if you covered this, but sort of as a side note, maybe an appetizer to a space weapons ban treaty is the idea of rules of the road for space. I wonder what the opinion of the panel is regarding rules of the road. It seems that you run into a number of the same problems. We don't really know what we're going to want to do to defend our space systems, to explore space-based missile defenses, so we ought not engage in any agreement before we know that. And some of the same issues of verification and ease of concealment and breakout potentials. But I'm curious if the same strong feelings prevail against the concept of rules of the road as maybe articulated by the Stimson Center as do against the draft space weapons ban document.
Anyone like to address that? Bob?
I like the idea of rules of the road if we can find rules of the road that allow us to protect our citizens and so forth. But I would recommend as the very first rule, you don't gratuitously shoot down satellites that put 250,000 pieces of dangerous shrapnel or space junk into the sky for the next century to knock down other people's, the military has a term they're using actually in the torture issue. They call it the golden rule, and basically they ask their people, if you would object if our enemy did this to our troops, don't do it. Well, there ought to be sort of a golden rule maybe in space too, that you don't go out there and totally, junk up space so nobody else can use it. And beyond that, I'd yield to the experts on what they can live with. But in general, just like law of the sea, it doesn't matter very much which way you turn when two ships approach each other on a collision course. It matters very much that you don't both turn in the same direction. And so having rules of the road, is very useful for things like that.
Other comments about that? Let me just add one point then, and that is rules of the road are a rather vague term. And just using the law of the sea analogy again, yes, you want rules of the road that deal, with which way you turn, port or starboard, et cetera. And we've been very, I think, successful in doing the right thing and working out with the former Soviet Union, now the Russian Federation, a series of rules to avoid certain kinds of sort of aggressive encounters of our warships on the high seas. A convention that was negotiated some years ago by the then Secretary of the Navy, who is now the senior senator from Virginia in the United States, John Warner. But if rules of the road then mean, for example, that we're really going to be limiting warships in terms of a variety of naval activities, et cetera, then you've got a problem. So I think there's the same thing in space. There may well be a variety of things that may be useful things to do, but we need to be very careful, as you've indicated in your question, to be very thoughtful about that and know precisely what it is we're doing before we get into those. Yes, Baker Springs?
Yeah. Question primarily probably for Admiral Williams, maybe also General Obering. There's been greater discussions in terms of the threat now about ballistic missiles as an anti-ship weapon. I was wondering if either of you could describe what's going on with regard to terminally guided ballistic missiles and what kind of anti-ship threat they pose.
I'm going to give General Obering the first opportunity to talk on that one, then I might add or not add.
Well, certainly, if you stop and think about the fact that we rely very heavily on force projection forward for access, for unrestricted access to the seas and lines of communication and supply, et cetera. You have to make sure that you are protecting any vulnerabilities that you could have to that force. If there were an operationally successful terminally guided weapon that could hold those at risk, that would be a grave concern to the military. When in my presentation I talked about potential emerging threats for the future, no matter which country that may be developing those are the type of things that we're addressing, that we're trying to take a look at. How would we deal with that? And that's what our development program is about in the Missile Defense Agency, is trying to look ahead because we want to make sure that in the rush to get capability out the door today, which is very, very important and in fact ties, I shouldn't say ties up, but represents about 75% of our budget. What you have to be concerned about is that you don't ignore what's coming down the road that could make a lot of that force structure obsolete, or that can make it ineffective, or that makes you unprepared for that emerging threat. So that is something we are looking at across the board in our programs.
I'll add, in 1992, when we were getting involved in ballistic missile defense, the CNO asked me are there any weapons out there that will get our ships? And I told him, not yet, sir. However, and I gave him the date was a little wrong. I told him in 2015 there probably will be. Looks like, and I think this is unclassified literature from China, that that perhaps they might have a system that would do that before 2015. But I think the time is now that we need a weapon, we need an interceptor that would handle those, and I think General Obering is addressing that with the Navy. So the answer is it's certainly a potential that we have to build something to counter that.
Yes.
There's been a proposal regarding conventional warheads being mounted on ICBMs. And I think one of the proposals has to do with the trajectory of the warhead that's different from the ballistic trajectory of an ICBM. And how does that fit into the ballistic missile program?
I think what you're referring to is that there may be cases in which an attacker is developing a capability that allows the missile to maneuver throughout its trajectory and does not follow a ballistic trajectory. That is also one of the capabilities that we have addressed in our development program. And it is a capability that you would attack on a multi-layered approach. You would need to have persistent surveillance and the ability to track throughout its entire flight. And we are developing those capabilities. You'd have to be able to have the ability to have what we call a delta V, or the energy to be able to counter the maneuvering that it's doing in any phase of the flight. And we have a program in our development programs to address that as well. So that is a concern that we have, that as nations may be able to develop non-ballistic missiles that travel in these very high speeds and high altitudes, can we engage those? And the analysis says that we would have a capability against that, and that's part of our ongoing development program.
Yes, over here.
Two questions, really. One is, what about non-state actors? I, too, arrived late, so if you already addressed this, I apologize. But as technology improves, and it rapidly is, I mean, we're not talking about Hamas or Hezbollah firing, you know, pretty cheap missiles into Israel. We could potentially, in 10, 15 years, be talking about an al-Qaeda firing missiles up at our satellites and attacking maybe not just our satellites, but those of other nations as well. Are we developing, or have we developed, the kind of technology that these systems would, these anti-missile systems would provide, that would protect our satellites from any potential threat? Because, I mean, we rely on it for everything, not just militarily, but commercially.
Who would like to respond to that? General?
I can give a shot. There's a couple of facets to your question that I'd like to go into, if I may. One is the non-state actors getting access to these types of weapons. As you indicate, we have seen in the Mideast in which you get non-state actors like Hezbollah, Hamas, getting the short-range missiles from state actors such as Iran or Syria. That has been demonstrated. And therefore, it begs the question as well, as they get longer and longer ranges or longer and longer capabilities, are they going to have access to those as well? That is something that's very much a concern to us, because when you start talking about a deterrent effect of any offensive strike or capability, you lose that with those organizations, because, frankly, they don't care. They're non-deterrable. So you have to have an active defense against those type of weapons. Now, if it is a weapon that, for example, they want to launch from a ship off of our coast in a non-state act or something like that, and then scuttle the ship, that's a real threat. It's something that we have dealt with, and that we have capabilities to be able to handle that. And it's something that I've been worrying about for quite a while. In fact, if you came in late, you missed the video I showed. In the very first video I showed, we actually launched a short-range missile off of a ship about 200 miles off Hawaii to engage it as a target. If they are firing those from within another country's territory, that's where you need, it depends on the location. You know, we will have boost phase defenses in about 8 years that can handle that type of threat, depending on the location. But if you're worried about a non-state actor launching from anywhere, either deep within countries or anywhere globally, you have to go to space to be able to handle that. You have to go to space to have the access, the response time, and the coverage to be able to defend yourself against that type of threat.
Did you have a second question?
Well, I guess the question more was also, how do we protect our satellites, not just what we have here on the ground?
Well,
I mean, if Al-Qaeda could fire a missile and destroy one of our communication satellites or something that would knock out global trading, I mean, that would cause a lot of havoc too.
Yeah, I believe that threat would be farther downstream. But my point is to you was in order to protect the satellite, you would have to be able to destroy that in the boost phase would be the most effective way of doing that.
We have time for one last question. Any remain? Yes. Yes.
General Obering, you mentioned that you went and modified the SM-3 and put software in. I'm assuming that those modifications were removed, that we don't have our Aegis ships out there don't have missiles with the capability to intercept satellites?
That's correct. But after we modified 3 missiles and we modified 3 ships to give us some redundancy and backup. When we were successful with the first missile from the first ship that fired, we then remodified or removed those modifications so that we could have those missiles and those ships go back into a missile defense role.
What about the software?
The same thing. We pulled that out.
Didn't throw it away though, right?
Well, you know, you never throw anything away.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, before I thank our panelists, I would like to congratulate General Obering and the entire group that participated in this remarkable and in many respects quite heroic feat on the part of the United States, and also as well, particularly Captain Hendrickson, the captain of the USS Lake Erie that we were privileged to have here with his wife and his son. And please join me in thanking all of our wonderful panelists.
You're as usual.
Coming up on C-SPAN 2, a discussion of the economy and the financial markets hosted by the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Then the International Monetary Fund Managing Director talks about the IMF plan to help countries in economic trouble. And World Bank President Robert Zoellick discusses the financial markets.
C-SPAN, created in 1979 by the cable television industry. But with no commercials, how is C-SPAN funded?
Public funding?
Private individuals? I'm assuming it's funded by the government.
I believe it's publicly funded.
Well, I haven't seen telethon, so I'm not really sure.
Corporate sponsorship.
By cable companies.
That's right. For nearly 30 years, America's cable companies have been providing C-SPAN programming to you commercial-free as a public service.
A discussion now on the economy and the government's efforts to stabilize the financial markets. We'll hear from 2 panels of economists and former federal officials. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget hosts this event. It's about an hour and a half.
I'm good. Thank you so much for coming. And I hope that all my last-minute things... Oh, look at those doodles, Bill. No, tax questions for this panel. They'll answer it. All right, we're going to move right into the next panel. Everybody, please feel free to hydrate. And those of you on C-SPAN, we're sorry you're not here, but you are lucky that you're in a more comfortable temperature. So our second panel is going to be focusing on the fiscal and budgetary consequences of the economic situation. Certainly, they will be large. All of this is complicated, of course, by the fact that it's an election year and that elections lend themselves to promises, of which we are seeing many this election. We have two candidates who've laid out budgets that would enlarge the deficit by hundreds of billions of dollars a year. And again, I direct you to the project that we're doing with the Pew Charitable Trust called U.S. Budget Watch at the website usbudgetwatch.org to learn more about the specifics of the different fiscal promises from both candidates. Given the deterioration in the budget, which was not in particularly good shape to begin with, a major question is how will the candidates adjust their priorities? And this, of